Quiero just the plane. You need to get off this plane right now. I'm sorry, what did I do?
What happens when dignity collides with discrimination at 35,000 feet? What would you do if the very people hired to ensure fairness treated you as though you didn't belong, despite proof that you did? On an ordinary flight bound for the West Coast, one woman's calm refusal to be silenced turned a simple seat dispute into a global reckoning. Amara Valon, a composed and steady black executive, boarded quietly with her first-class ticket. But when a flight attendant chose suspicion over service, the cabin became a courtroom and the world became its audience. Phones began streaming, voices clashed, authority was tested, and a secret identity was revealed that no one expected. What started as humiliation for one passenger became humiliation for an entire airline, forcing a confrontation with questions we all must face. Who do we believe when conflict arises? Why does respect too often depend on appearance, power, or privilege? And how far would you go to defend your dignity when silence feels easier? This is not just a story about a flight. It's about justice in motion, about courage in the face of bias, and about the moment one woman chose truth over convenience. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe because you won't want to miss what happens next. The terminal at Orion International pulsed with its usual morning rhythm, a blend of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and the scattered aroma of burnt espresso drifting from the coffee kiosks. Travelers shuffled forward in imperfect lines, some already weary before their journey had even begun. Amid this movement, Amara Valon kept her stride even and unhurried, her eyes scanning with practiced calm. She carried only a compact leather bag and a slender carry-on, the sort of luggage chosen more for function than for show. Her outfit, too, was deliberate dark denim. A soft cream blouse tucked neatly at the waist, a blazer draped casually across her shoulders. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek bun, her makeup minimal yet precise. Nothing about her appearance suggested power or position, and that was exactly the point. For the last 3 months, Amara had lived in two worlds. In one, she was the newly appointed Chief Operating Officer of Skycrest Airlines, hired after a bruising year of public relations disasters and customer complaints about bias in service. In the other, she was an ordinary traveler, moving anonymously among the crowds, experiencing her airline the way her customers did. Today was one of those undercover days, and she welcomed it, even though she knew the risk of disappointment. She'd learned long ago that progress in any industry, especially one as stubbornly traditional as aviation, rarely arrived without resistance. Still, she believed in the power of small, decisive moments. And as she reached Gate 42 for Flight 918 to San Aurelio, she had no idea that the moment waiting for her would be far from small. At the counter, the gate agent, Callan Reese, was juggling boarding passes with mechanical precision. His tie sat slightly crooked, his expression carefully neutral, but his manner carried undertones that Amara noticed immediately. She had been trained to notice. He greeted a young white couple with warm banter about their honeymoon, his voice animated, eyes sparkling. A few steps later, when a middle-aged black man approached, Callan's tone cooled, his smile faded, and his words shrank into a clipped exchange of ID and boarding stub. Amara's turn came next. "Good morning," she said with a natural smile, extending her pass. Callan's eyes flicked from her to the boarding pass. Something tightened in his jaw, almost imperceptibly, but enough. "Morning," he replied, his tone flat. He scanned the pass. The small beep confirmed its validity. First class, seat 2A. Still, his pause lingered half a second too long, his gaze traveling over her clothes, her hair, the bag at her side. Finally, he nodded. All right, Ms. Valon, you're set. No welcome aboard, no pleasant wishes for her trip, just the bare minimum. The words clipped like a line cut too short. Amara accepted it without change in her expression, though her mind noted it with sharp clarity. Her observations were not about gathering ammunition, they were about understanding a pattern. If patterns proved consistent, they spoke to culture. And culture, not isolated mistakes, was what needed dismantling. She moved toward the jet bridge. Ahead, 2 flight attendants waited at the door. The first, a tall man with salt and pepper hair named Dorian Crest, smiled politely but distantly. The second, a blonde woman with a polished bun and a tight smile, introduced herself as Seraphine Clade, where Dorian's greeting carried bland professionalism. Seraphine's greeting carried judgment veiled in civility. "Welcome aboard," Seraphine said, her tone lighter for the White family just before Amara, then cooling the moment Amara stepped forward. Amara held her gaze, answering with warmth. "Thank you. Excited for the trip." Seraphine's eyes flicked down to the first-class designation on the boarding pass in Amara's hand. Her nod was subtle, but the shift in her expression wasn't. It was a look Amara knew too well, the unspoken disbelief that someone like her belonged at the front of the aircraft. The moment passed in silence, but it left a trace in the air. Inside the first-class cabin, the atmosphere hummed with hushed conversations and the sound of carry-on bags sliding into overhead bins. Amara walked with steady composure down the aisle, her gaze meeting the eyes of an older black man already seated near the front. Ezra Thorne, though she did not yet know his name, tipped his head in quiet solidarity, a recognition built not on words but on shared experience. Across the aisle, a woman with olive skin and a warm smile, later she would introduce herself as Luciana Marquez, offered Amara an encouraging glance, as though to say, "You're not imagining this." Amara reached her seat, 2A, and stowed her bag. The leather creaked softly as she placed it in the overhead bin. She settled in, her movements graceful but deliberate, her mind still replaying the sequence from the gate to the cabin door. Already, the day's evaluation was writing itself. But the evaluation was not the only thing in her mind. Beneath her composed exterior, Amara wrestled with familiar questions. How many times would she need to endure these micro-assessments? These silent tests of legitimacy would confronting them today set back the very reforms she was fighting for, casting her as combative instead of constructive, or would silence only reinforce the culture that allowed them to persist? She thought briefly of her parents, both educators who had marched decades earlier for voting rights. Her father used to remind her, "There will always be a moment when you'll have to decide whether your comfort is worth more than your principles." She hadn't realized how often those moments would arise, nor how much they could weigh on a person. Her reflection broke when Seraphine appeared beside her row. "Excuse me, ma'am," Seraphine said with a too bright smile. "May I see your boarding pass again?" Amara looked up slowly, her heartbeat steady but deliberate. The pass was in her hand, still warm from where she had folded it against her palm. She extended it calmly. Seraphine studied it longer than necessary, her eyes moving from the paper to Amara and back again. The skepticism was as loud as if she had spoken it aloud. "Thank you," Seraphine said finally, her voice tinged with something that was not gratitude. She handed it back and pivoted smoothly to greet the white businessman sliding into the seat behind Amara. "Mr. Sloan," Seraphine beamed. "So good to have you with us again. Can I take your jacket?" The contrast was unmistakable. Gareth Sloan chuckled politely, handing over his coat. As he sat, his eyes flicked toward Amara, the awkward awareness clear in his expression. He knew he had just witnessed something off, even if he couldn't quite name it. Amara turned her gaze to the window, letting the city's skyline blur as the aircraft door closed. She felt the familiar weight pressing on her chest, not fear, but anticipation. She didn't yet know the confrontation waiting ahead, only that it would demand a choice silence or disruption. The hum of the engines began to rise. This flight, Amara thought, would not end the way anyone expected. The plane hummed softly as passengers shuffled into their seats, the air thick with the scent of leather upholstery and recycled air. The overhead bins slammed shut one after another, a symphony of impatient travelers eager to settle. Amara Veillon adjusted her seatbelt and folded her hands neatly on her lap. She could feel eyes on her, some curious, some indifferent, and a few quietly skeptical. She had felt this gaze before the weight of strangers silently asking if she belonged where she was sitting. Beside her, Gareth Sloan reclined with practiced ease, already pulling out a tablet from his briefcase. His posture was relaxed, but he glanced toward Amara again, as though something about the earlier interaction with Seraphine Clade still lingered in his mind. Across the aisle, Luciana Marquez scrolled through her phone, but every so often her eyes flicked up, subtle but deliberate, offering Amara a faint nod of solidarity. The atmosphere shifted when Seraphine reappeared, her smile painted but brittle. She leaned closer to Amara's row, carrying a clipboard that seemed unnecessary in the digital age. Her eyes skimmed Amara's face before dropping again to the paper. "Ms. Veillon," she said in a voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I'll need to verify your seating assignment once more. Our system is showing a discrepancy." Amara felt the silence ripple. Conversations dimmed. The businessman in the row behind stopped tapping his tablet. Ezra Thorne, 2 seats ahead, turned his head slowly, his expression one of weary recognition. Calmly, Amara reached into her purse and retrieved the boarding pass. "You verified this earlier," she said softly, her tone controlled, unshaken. She handed it over without hesitation. Seraphine examined the pass with exaggerated care, holding it a second too long. Her jaw tightened. "Strange," she murmured. "This ticket appears to belong to another passenger. It may have been issued in error." A murmur rose from the cabin. Gareth shifted beside Amara, his frown deepening. "That can't be right," he interjected firmly. "I watched her scan through the gate. No problem at all." Seraphine's eyes flicked toward him, irritation flashing for a moment before she recovered her brittle smile. "Sometimes the system doesn't update properly. It's safer to reassign questionable tickets. There's a seat available in economy." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Economy. Where you belong. Amara inhaled deeply, her heart beat steady. She had trained herself for moments like this, moments where her anger threatened to crack the calm she projected. The temptation to lash out tugged at her chest, but she anchored herself with the thought of her father's words, "Never let them write your story for you." She looked directly at Seraphine. "This is my seat. My ticket is valid. I will remain here." Her voice was measured, strong without being raised, for a beat. Seraphine seemed caught off guard by Amara's composure. Then she pressed forward, her voice slightly sharper. "If you refuse to comply, I may need to involve security. This is a matter of flight safety." Across the aisle, Luciana set down her phone. "I'm sorry, but I've been recording since you came over," she said clearly, her accent curling around the words. "This woman has done nothing wrong. She has a valid ticket. Why are you singling her out?" The recording device glowed in her hand. Several passengers perked up, realizing the confrontation was being documented. Ezra Thorne's tired eyes gleamed with something closer to defiance now. He turned in his seat, speaking with quiet authority. "I've been flying first class for over 30 years, he said. "Every time. They check my ticket twice, sometimes 3 times. Always me, never my white colleagues. It's not the system, it's the pattern." A hush fell. Even Gareth paused, glancing at Ezra with new respect. Seraphine flushed, the grip on her clipboard tightening. Amara's inner voice wrestled with itself. Part of her wanted to end this charade quickly, to reveal her true position as COO and silence the humiliation. But another part of her, the part that had brought her on this undercover journey, whispered patience. Let them show who they are without knowing who you are. That's the only way to expose the truth. She chose silence for the moment. The engines roared as the aircraft prepared for pushback. Dorian Crest, the other attendant, moved through the aisle, visibly uncomfortable. He avoided Amara's eyes, his gaze fixed on the tray tables and belts, as though pretending not to notice the tension unraveling a few feet away. Seraphine bent slightly closer to Amara, her voice dropping into a low warning. "I'll give you one more chance. Either move to economy quietly, or I will escalate." Before Amara could answer, Gareth spoke again, louder this time. "She's not moving anywhere. You've checked her pass twice. This is harassment." The word landed like a spark in dry grass. Harassment. Passengers shifted uneasily, some murmuring agreement. A man in a window seat pulled out his phone. Another passenger leaned across the aisle to whisper to Luciana, who simply lifted her phone higher, making sure her recording was clear. Amara felt the tide beginning to turn. For once, she wasn't alone in pushing back, and yet she remained calm, her voice unwavering as she finally replied, "You may call security if you believe it's necessary. I welcome the chance to clarify this in front of someone with actual authority." The boldness of her words seemed to stun Seraphine. Her mouth opened slightly, but no immediate response came. The tension broke only when the intercom clicked and a male voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Idris Kale from the flight deck. We've been informed of a minor delay. Please remain seated while we sort through a systems issue. Thank you for your patience." Seraphine seized the announcement like a lifeline. "You see, even the captain acknowledges a system issue." She straightened, clutching her clipboard to her chest as if it offered armor. But Amara caught the look Gareth gave her, skeptical of Seraphine's interpretation. Luciana's camera stayed fixed. Ezra's eyes stayed locked on Seraphine, unwavering. Amara leaned back in her seat, her composure intact, though inside her thoughts swirled. She knew what was coming. She knew that once security stepped onto the plane, this standoff would no longer be contained to whispers and sidelong glances. it would spill into something undeniable, something that no airline statement could easily bury. She thought of the countless complaint reports she had reviewed in her office. The words echoed in her mind now, treated as though I didn't belong, asked to prove my seat twice, ignored while others were served. Each line had once been statistics on a screen. Now they were living, breathing reality around her. Her chest tightened with an ache that was both anger and sadness. How many more Geralds, how many more Ezras had endured this quiet cruelty for years, left with no power to challenge it? The wheels of the aircraft had not yet moved, but Amara knew this flight was already headed into turbulence far greater than any storm outside. She placed her boarding pass carefully back into her purse and folded her hands once again, her posture upright, her expression composed. Outwardly, she appeared calm. Inwardly, she was preparing for confrontation, for revelation, for change. The seatbelt sign blinked overhead. The aircraft's hum seemed louder, restless. The moment balanced on a razor's edge, ready to tip. This was only the beginning. The cabin air grew dense, the kind of heavy silence that prickled at the back of the neck. Conversations in first class had stilled to whispers, then stopped altogether. Phones glowed in more hands now, their cameras discreetly angled but unmistakably present. A single act of scrutiny had become a spectacle. Amara Velan kept her posture measured, back straight, hands folded in her lap, but her mind churned beneath the surface. Each second stretched. She replayed Seraphine's words in her head, the sting of them sharp but familiar. How many times had she heard the same sentiment in different disguises? You don't belong here. Not in this space, not at this table, not in this seat, across the aisle. Luciana Marquez's phone remained lifted, her voice quiet but steady. Everything is being documented, she said, as if warning the flight attendant that the old rules of invisibility no longer applied. Ezra Thorne leaned forward in his seat, his hands resting heavily on his cane. "Child, you don't have to prove anything," he murmured in Amara's direction. His tone was soft, almost fatherly, but it carried through the silence of the cabin. "We've been proving ourselves for generations. Let them prove themselves this time." The words pressed against the wall Amara had built inside herself. She exhaled slowly, steadying the rush of emotion that threatened to break her composure. Seraphine Clade's smile had thinned to a strained line. Her clipboard trembled slightly in her grip. Betraying nerves she tried to hide behind authority. "This is a security matter," she repeated, louder this time, addressing the entire cabin. "If the passenger in 2A does not comply, we will be unable to depart." From the row behind, a man in a gray blazer muttered, "She's got a ticket. Let the plane leave already." A ripple of agreement stirred among passengers. Not everyone spoke up, but more than a few heads nodded. Seraphine's face flushed. Losing control of the narrative was not part of her plan. She turned sharply to her colleague. "Dorian, go notify the captain. Tell him we need ground security." Dorian Crest hesitated, his eyes darting between Seraphine and Amara, then toward the passengers watching. His lips parted, but no words came. He turned reluctantly, walking toward the cockpit. The shuffle of his shoes on the carpet was almost loud. Amara's heartbeat remained steady, but her mind raced. She could stop this now. She could reveal her title, her authority, her power to end the standoff with a single card pulled from her wallet. But if she did, the truth of the experience would vanish. reduced to a misunderstanding about an important passenger. The system would escape unchallenged. Her inner voice wavered. Was it fair to let herself be humiliated in the name of exposing a truth she already knew? Would, staying silent until the breaking point, risk not only her dignity but the dignity of every passenger of color watching this unfold? The captain's voice broke the silence again, this time more urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We are addressing a seating discrepancy. This will be resolved shortly." Seraphine latched onto his words as validation. "Thank you, Captain," she said, her tone rising. "You heard him. There is a discrepancy, and it must be corrected before we can leave the gate." Gareth Sloane, seated beside Amara, finally pushed himself upright, his voice firm. "No, what we heard was that there's a passenger in first class with a valid ticket, being harassed by a flight attendant, and I'll testify to that." The cabin's tension cracked like glass. Murmurs grew louder. Passengers shifted, some pulling phones higher, others whispering openly now. A woman 2 rows back called out, "Why aren't you checking anyone else's ticket? Why only hers?" Seraphine turned, her composure fraying. "Please, everyone remain seated. This is for your safety." Ezra chuckled dryly, his voice gravelly but strong. "Safety has nothing to do with it. This is about control, and the wrong kind of control." Seraphine's jaw tightened. She bent closer to Amara once more, her words pitched low but urgent. "Why are you making this so difficult? There's an empty row in economy. Just take it, and this is over." Amara's eyes lifted to meet hers, calm and piercing. "Because my presence here isn't the mistake. Your assumptions are." The words cut with quiet precision. Seraphine recoiled slightly, her mouth working soundlessly. For the first time, she seemed to realize the ground beneath her was shifting. A sharp knock echoed from the cockpit door. Moments later, Dorian returned, his expression troubled. "The captain wants a word," he said softly. Seraphine brushed past him, marching toward the front with rigid strides. The moment she disappeared into the cockpit, the cabin seemed to exhale collectively. The air felt lighter, but only slightly, for everyone knew the confrontation was not yet over. Amara leaned back in her seat, her composure outwardly unshaken. Inside, though, her thoughts spun. She imagined the headlines, the commentary, the endless debate about what was happening here. She wondered if the passengers' recording would become allies or critics. She wondered if she was asking too much of them to recognize injustice when it stood in front of them, beside her. Gareth leaned closer. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice low. "I've flown this airline for 15 years. I've never once been asked twice for my ticket. Not once." Amara gave a faint nod, acknowledging his words. "That's exactly the problem," she replied quietly. Ezra turned slightly in his seat, his cane resting against his leg. "You remind me of my daughter," he said, his voice gentler now. "Strong on the outside, but I can see the weight you're carrying. Don't let them break you with it. Use it." Amara held his gaze for a moment. His eyes carried decades of fatigue, but also a spark of resilience that mirrored her own. She drew strength from it. Minutes dragged, the cabin restless. Children fidgeted, adults sighed, tension mounting. Luciana whispered into her phone, updating whoever was on the other end. "Yes, still recording. Yes, she's standing her ground. At last." The cockpit door swung open. Seraphine emerged, her face pale, her jaw stiff. Captain Idris Kale followed, tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp. His eyes scanned the cabin quickly, settling on Amara. Recognition flickered, though he masked it carefully. "Ms. Veylan," he said, his voice even, respectful. "May I speak with you privately?" The silence that followed was thick. Passengers leaned forward, craning to hear. Seraphine stiffened, realizing the captain's tone was not aligned with hers. Amara rose slowly, smoothing her blouse with deliberate grace. She met the captain's eyes, a quiet understanding passing between them. She could reveal herself now. She could end this farce in a single sentence, but she also knew the power of timing. She stepped into the aisle, her presence commanding without effort. Every eye followed her as she walked toward the front, the hum of anticipation electric. At the threshold of the cockpit, she paused, turning back briefly to the cabin. Her voice, calm yet resonant, carried through the silence. "I am not moving to economy. And before this flight departs, everyone will understand why." Gasps rippled. Phones lifted higher. The moment stretched, suspended on the edge of revelation. Then she stepped through the door, leaving behind a cabin brimming with questions, whispers, and a sense that something extraordinary was unfolding before their eyes. The cockpit door clicked shut behind Amara, sealing her in a narrow space that smelled faintly of engine oil and strong coffee. Captain Idris Kale stood with his hands folded neatly behind his back, his tall frame nearly brushing the ceiling. His eyes met hers for a long second, the kind of glance that carried recognition but also unspoken caution. "Ms. Veylan," he began, his voice measured. "I know who you are, but my crew doesn't, and right now the cabin is on the edge of panic. We need to resolve this before it escalates further." Amara studied him carefully. The captain's tone was respectful, but his urgency betrayed a fear she had seen in executives, managers, even politicians, the fear of headlines, the fear of fallout, more than the fear of injustice itself. "Resolve," she repeated softly, "and by that, you mean send me to economy so we can all move on." Kyle shifted uncomfortably, his uniform buttons gleaming in the dim light. De-escalate. If this goes viral, if passengers feel unsafe, the consequences won't just be for the crew. It'll fall on the airline as a whole, including you. Amara felt a quiet spark ignite in her chest. She straightened her blazer, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Captain, the consequences already belong to the airline. Every complaint ignored, every passenger dismissed, every attendant trained to believe their suspicion matters more than a customer's dignity. This is the consequence. I'm not creating it. I'm exposing it." Kale inhaled sharply, then exhaled through his nose. For a moment, he looked almost relieved, as though someone had finally said aloud what he had been afraid to acknowledge. But his lips pressed into a thin line. "You understand, if you reveal who you are now, there's no putting it back in the box. This isn't just about a flight. It'll be national news." Amara's mind flickered to the weight of it all. She imagined the cameras, the headlines, the board meetings where her decisions would be dissected and doubted. She imagined investors questioning whether she had acted strategically or emotionally. She imagined the lives of people like Ezra Thorne, who would see in her decision either validation or betrayal. Her chest tightened, but she held his gaze. Then let it be news. Better a scandal that leads to change than silence that protects the same cycle. Kyle nodded slowly, a trace of reluctant respect in his expression. Very well. I'll back your decision. But understand, this cabin will not leave the ground until you address them yourself. They need to hear it from you." Amara inclined her head. "Then they will." When she stepped back into the cabin, the atmosphere was electric. Dozens of eyes locked onto her at once, their gazes carrying curiosity, skepticism, even quiet hope. Phones hovered mid-air, lenses capturing every detail. Seraphine Clade stood stiffly near the galley, her face pale but her jaw tight. Dorian Crest lingered nearby, his expression troubled, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Amara paused at the front, allowing the weight of silence to fill the space. She felt the tremor of her pulse in her fingertips but forced her breathing to remain steady. She could almost hear her father's voice again. "When the moment comes, do not whisper. Speak, so even the walls remember. My name," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the cabin, "is Amara Valon." A murmur rippled instantly through the passengers. Phones shifted higher. Seraphine's lips parted. Confusion etched across her face. "I am not just a passenger," Amara continued, her tone deliberate. I am the chief operating officer of Skycrest Airlines. This flight, this airline, every member of this crew, all of it falls under my responsibility. And what I've witnessed here is not a seating error. It is a human error, a moral error, one that has repeated itself too many times in too many cabins. Gasps filled the silence. Gareth Sloane leaned back in his seat with a satisfied shake of his head, muttering, "I knew it." Luciana Marquez whispered into her phone, "She's the COO, she's running this airline." Ezra Thorne's eyes glistened, his cane tapping lightly against the floor in a gesture of approval. Amara lifted the boarding pass in her hand. "This is valid. It was valid when I boarded. It was valid when it was scanned. It was valid when I was asked to prove myself. Not once, but twice. And still, I was told to move because someone decided I did not belong here." Her voice sharpened, though still calm. "But I do belong here, and so does every customer who buys a ticket, regardless of their race, their age, their accent, or the assumptions of those serving them." The cabin erupted in hushed conversation, the weight of her words pressing down. Passengers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others stunned into silence. Seraphine's face flushed crimson. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but defiant. "I didn't know who you were." Amara turned her gaze toward her, steady and unflinching. "That's the point. You shouldn't have to know someone's title to treat them with respect. You shouldn't need to fear their power before offering them dignity. Every passenger deserves the same courtesy you gave to Mr. Sloane when you took his jacket with a smile." Gareth shifted in his seat, awkwardly clearing his throat, though his eyes showed gratitude for the truth spoken aloud. Luciana raised her phone higher, narrating under her breath. "She's saying what all of us have seen." Amara exhaled slowly, scanning the faces before her. Mothers holding children, businessmen in suits, elderly travelers with weary eyes. They were not simply witnesses now, they were part of the record, part of the moment that would not vanish when the aircraft landed. Her decision came clear in her mind, sharp as a blade. "This flight," she announced, "will not depart today. Not under these conditions. Not with this crew. Because what just happened here is not just an inconvenience. It is a breach of trust between this airline and the people we serve. And that is something I will not allow to continue." A collective gasp rippled across the cabin. Some passengers groaned, worried about their schedules, their meetings, their connections, but others clapped quietly, a smattering of support growing louder with each second. Ezra Thorne raised his cane in the air in silent salute. Seraphine's mouth worked soundlessly, her clipboard clutched like a lifeline. Dorian Crest stared at the floor, unable to move. Amara's voice softened but carried conviction. I apologize to every passenger here for the disruption, but understand this disruption is the only way systems change. Sometimes comfort must be sacrificed for justice, and today, justice demands we face what has been ignored. The cabin roared with sound now. Some cheered, some complained, but none remained unmoved. Every phone camera captured her face, her words, her calm authority. As Amara returned to her seat, Gareth leaned close, his voice awed. You just turned this flight into history. Amara settled back, her heart pounding but her face serene. She looked toward the window, the runway stretching endlessly beyond, and thought not of herself but of the passengers who would never have her power, her platform, her chance to demand change. For them, she had chosen to speak, and there would be no going back. The shock of Amara's declaration lingered in the cabin like turbulence no seatbelt could steady. Conversations erupted in pockets, passengers arguing, whispering, gesturing toward her as though she had suddenly transformed from anonymous traveler to spectacle. The sound was a storm of disbelief, admiration, irritation, and relief, all colliding in the narrow space of first class. Luciana Marquez adjusted her phone, her voice carrying quietly but firmly as she continued her live stream. You're all seeing this, she said into the lens. The COO of Skycrest Airlines just grounded her own flight because she was treated like she didn't belong here. This is history unfolding in real time. Several passengers groaned at the mention of grounding. A man in a tailored Navy suit muttered, Unbelievable. I've got a meeting in San Aurelio in 3 hours. This is going to cost me a contract. From the front row, Ezra Thorne spoke with the weariness of decades. And how many contracts have been lost because men like you assumed our time, our dignity, was worth less than yours? His cane tapped lightly against the floor, punctuation to his point. The businessman flushed, shifting uncomfortably, but he didn't respond. Amara remained seated, her face composed, but inside her heart still hammered. She could feel every glance, every judgment, every whispered conversation bouncing off the cabin walls. She had expected resistance, but not the tidal wave of it crashing all at once. The question pressed at her chest had she just sacrificed credibility for symbolism. Her mind returned to a memory from her early career, when she was passed over for a promotion despite outperforming her peers. The justification had been coded in soft language, not the right cultural fit, but the sting had burned. That night, her mother had held her hands and said, Your silence won't save you. It never saved me. It never saved your grandmother. Speak, even if your voice shakes. Her voice hadn't shaken today, but the tremors lived inside her, where no one could see. Seraphine Clade, her face pale, finally found her footing again. She stepped into the aisle, clipboard pressed against her chest like armor. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced, her voice carrying forced authority, we ask for your patience. This situation is being reviewed internally. Please remain calm so we may proceed with next steps. The words did little to soothe. Passengers argued openly now. One woman leaned across the aisle toward Luciana. Turn that off. You're making it worse." Luciana shook her head without hesitation. "No. If it's not recorded, it will be denied. That's how this always goes. Behind Amara." Gareth Sloane sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't care if this delays me," he said aloud, his voice sharp enough to carry. "This is bigger than one flight." A younger passenger, earbuds dangling around his neck, chimed in from across the cabin. "Man's right. They'd never treat me that way. I've flown this route 10 times. Nobody's checked my ticket twice." His words carried an edge of shame disguised as solidarity. Seraphine's composure cracked further. She turned toward Amara, her voice lower now. "Desperate? Please, Ms. Valon, think about the airline, about the crew, about what this will do to all of us." Amara looked up at her, her tone unflinching. "I'm thinking about the airline, and this is exactly why change is non-negotiable." The silence that followed was broken by Ezra, his voice resonant with quiet conviction. "She's right. We've been invisible for too long, and invisibility is a prison." His words struck deeper than any argument. Even Gareth seemed moved, his eyes softening as he glanced at the elderly man. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, steady but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Security officers will be boarding momentarily to assist in resolving the matter. We thank you for your cooperation." A collective groan rippled through the cabin. Phones rose higher, lenses fixed on the aisle, waiting for the spectacle to deepen. Amara sat still, her pulse steady now. This was the moment she had both dreaded and prepared for the entrance of authority, the inevitable attempt to strip her power away in the name of order. She braced herself, reminding her heart to remain calm, her voice to remain steady. 2 officers entered through the cabin door, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. They paused near Seraphine, who leaned in quickly, her words hushed but animated. One officer nodded, then turned his gaze toward Amara. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "we've been told there's a seating discrepancy. We'll need to verify your boarding documents." Amara retrieved her pass with deliberate calm, holding it up for him to see. "You may verify it. It's valid. It always has been." The officer took the pass, scanning it with a handheld device. A soft beep confirmed its legitimacy. He frowned slightly, glancing at his partner. "This checks out." Murmurs rippled again. Passengers exchanged looks, some smug, others sheepish, a few openly relieved. Luciana whispered into her phone. "Verified, just like she said." Seraphine's face hardened. There must be some mistake. The manifest. But the officer cut her off. "No mistake. This seat belongs to her." He handed the pass back to Amara, his voice calm but tinged with finality. "You're cleared, ma'am. For the first time." Seraphine faltered completely. Her lips parted, then closed again, no words escaping. She looked toward Dorian, but his eyes remained fixed on the floor. Amara accepted the boarding pass and tucked it carefully back into her purse. Her voice carried softly, but every ear strained to hear. It should not take an officer with a scanner to validate what was already true. Respect should not require proof of power. The officer beside her shifted, as though the words weighed on him too. He gave a faint nod, then stepped back toward the aisle. Ezra Thorne smiled faintly, his voice carrying a note of triumph. And still, they act surprised when the truth shows itself. Amara leaned back in her seat, the rhythm of her breath steady. her mind calmer than it had been all morning. She knew this was far from over. The cameras, the passengers, the airline itself, all of them would carry this story forward. But in this moment, she allowed herself the smallest taste of vindication. Her eyes closed briefly, not in retreat but in reflection. She thought of her father again, of her mother, of every silent moment endured by those who came before her. For them, she would not waver. For them, she would not apologize for belonging. When she opened her eyes, the cabin had shifted. Not everyone was supportive. Some passengers still grumbled, still worried about their schedules, but the air no longer carried the same unquestioned acceptance of Seraphine's authority. Something had cracked, and through the crack, truth had spilled. It was only the beginning. The officer's confirmation should have ended the matter, but instead it only seemed to sharpen the divide inside the cabin. Some passengers clapped politely, murmuring approval, while others sighed in irritation, muttering about delays and missed connections. Phones kept recording, their glowing screens like unblinking witnesses in the crowded space. Seraphine Clade stood frozen for a moment. Her clipboard pressed so tightly against her chest that her knuckles turned pale. Then, with a flicker of determination in her eyes, she stepped forward again. Her smile was gone now, replaced with a strained defiance. Regardless of what the scanner says, she insisted, her voice carrying across the cabin. I am responsible for the order and safety in this section. If I believe a passenger is being disruptive, I have the authority to act. The businessman in the navy suit groaned audibly. For God's sake, just let the plane leave. She has a ticket. What more do you need? Ezra Thorne shifted in his seat, his cane tapping the floor with a deliberate rhythm. What she needs, he said, his voice gravelly but strong, is control. Control she doesn't deserve. Seraphine's head whipped toward him, her cheeks flushed. Sir, please refrain from interfering. But Ezra didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his eyes piercing. I've lived 80 years, young lady. I've seen this game played too many times. It's always the same script, only the uniforms change. The cabin murmured with agreement. Gareth Sloane, seated next to Amara, shook his head in disbelief. I travel every week, he said loudly. Never once have I been asked to prove my seat twice. Never once have I been told to move to economy. This isn't about disruption. It's about discrimination. Luciana Marquez lifted her phone higher, narrating to her viewers, You can hear it yourself. Other passengers are confirming the pattern. This isn't an isolated incident. Seraphine's jaw clenched, her authority crumbling with every word spoken against her. Yet still, she pressed on, clinging to procedure like a shield. Ms. Velan has made her position clear, but so have I. If she continues to disrupt the boarding process, we cannot depart safely. Amara inhaled slowly, her calm a fragile thread she clutched tightly. Her inner voice churned with doubt. She had been vindicated, yet the humiliation lingered, refusing to release its grip. The officer's scanner had proven her right, but the deeper truth was already clear. No proof would ever be enough for someone determined to doubt her place. For a moment, she questioned herself. Should she have stayed silent, taken the lower seat, avoided the spectacle? Would the airline's reforms have been better served by subtlety rather than confrontation? The thought stung, but then Ezra's earlier words returned to her mind. We've been proving ourselves for generations. Let them prove themselves this time. Her silence had never saved her. Silence had never saved anyone. She straightened in her seat, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. This flight will not depart with a crew that treats passengers as suspects rather than customers. I am not disruptive. I am resisting being diminished. That's a very different thing. The words carried like a verdict through the cabin. Some passengers applauded softly, while others groaned louder, frustrated at the deepening standoff. One woman, further back, raised her voice. I have kids waiting at home. I don't care about politics. I just want to get to San Aurelio. Luciana turned slightly in her seat to face her. That's the problem. You call it politics. For her, it's survival. The woman scowled, but said nothing more. Captain Idris Kale emerged from the cockpit, his face lined with tension. His voice was steady, but his eyes revealed fatigue. Ladies and gentlemen, please understand. We cannot depart until this issue is resolved. We're now on a rolling delay, and every minute costs the airline significantly. I urge everyone to remain patient. The businessman in the Navy suit muttered, Then resolve it already. Fire the attendant and move on. His voice was laced with sarcasm, but it earned a few nods from nearby travelers. Seraphine stiffened at the remark, her pride visibly wounded. She glanced at the captain, her voice trembling with indignation. Are you really going to undermine your crew like this? In front of everyone, Kale's gaze hardened. Seraphine, the officers have confirmed the ticket is valid. This matter should be closed. Her lips quivered as if she wanted to argue, but the captain's tone brooked no further debate. She turned sharply, retreating toward the galley, her clipboard clattering against the metal counter as she dropped it. The cabin exhaled, the atmosphere shifting, though tension still lingered like static. Amara sat quietly, her pulse slowing, yet her thoughts spun, heavy with conflict. Part of her pitied Seraphine, knowing this humiliation might shadow her career forever. But another part of her burned with frustration. Why did empathy always fall to those most wounded? Why must dignity be purchased with patience again and again? Ezra leaned back, watching her with knowing eyes. Don't you dare feel guilty, he murmured. She built that cage herself. You didn't lock her in it. Amara's lips curved in the faintest smile. His words steadied her resolve. Gareth tapped her arm gently. You've made your point. The whole world's going to see this. But are you sure about grounding the flight? You'll make enemies in your own house? Amara turned her gaze toward him, her voice steady. Sometimes enemies are the only proof you've done the right thing. The cabin door opened again, this time with ground staff entering. A supervisor in a sharp Navy uniform stepped forward, his badge gleaming under the cabin lights. His voice was clipped, professional, but tinged with unease. We've been instructed to suspend the flight temporarily while the situation is reviewed. Groans erupted, louder now. Passengers checked watches, muttered into phones, scrolled furiously through their devices to rebook connections. But amid the frustration, a thread of something else wove through the cabin recognition that this was no longer a private dispute, but a public reckoning. Luciana whispered into her phone. The airline's suspending the flight. They're actually suspending it. This is unprecedented. Ezra smiled faintly, whispering almost to himself. Finally. Amara closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling the heavy air of the cabin. She felt the sting of frustration, the burden of responsibility, the weight of the eyes upon her. But beneath it all, she felt something else, certainty. The certainty that silence would never have carved a crack in the wall. Only confrontation could. When she opened her eyes again, Seraphine was watching her from the galley, her expression a mixture of resentment and fear. Their eyes met, a silent acknowledgement that the battle between them was no longer personal. It was systemic, and it had only just begun. The announcement of the suspension rippled through the cabin like a shock wave. Phones lit up instantly, passengers fumbling with apps to reschedule, thumbs typing furiously across glass screens, the narrow aisle filled with the restless energy of travelers on the edge of mutiny. Luciana Marquez. Her phone held steady despite the turbulence of emotions in the air, spoke with the rhythm of someone who knew every word mattered. For those joining now, yes, you're hearing this correctly, Flight 372 has been suspended because a first-class passenger, a black woman, was accused of not belonging in her seat, despite multiple confirmations. We're still on board. The world deserves to see what this looks like. The comments on her stream scrolled so fast she could hardly read them. People were already choosing sides. Some wrote words of solidarity, others dismissed it as exaggeration. But the numbers in the corner of her screen climbed relentlessly hundreds, then thousands. Amara Valon sat motionless in her seat, her posture calm, but her mind alive with conflicting voices. She felt the weight of passengers' resentment pressing against her from all directions. She imagined their whispered curses, business lost, families delayed, time stolen. Was she responsible for all of it? Another voice pushed back, steady, defiant. You didn't cause this, you exposed it. Ezra Thorne reached across the aisle, resting a weathered hand on the armrest near her. Don't let their frustration turn into your guilt, he said softly. They were always going to blame you for making noise. That's how it works. But noise is the only thing that ever rattles the cage. Gareth Sloan leaned closer, his voice low. He's right. Look around. Half of them hate the delay, but the other half are finally asking questions they never asked before. That doesn't happen without a disruption. The cabin door opened again, and the ground supervisor returned, now accompanied by two higher-ranking staff members in dark suits. Their presence drew a hush, the kind of silence that falls when the air itself is waiting. One of them, a tall woman with sharp features, spoke with measured authority. We apologize for the disruption. This flight will not depart until a full assessment is complete. Passengers who wish to deplane may do so and will be accommodated on later departures. Groans, louder this time, burst through the cabin. A man in the second row shot up from his seat. This is absurd. One person throws a tantrum and now 300 of us are punished. His voice cracked with indignation. Luciana swung her phone toward him. It's not a tantrum. It's discrimination. Maybe if you lived through it, you'd recognize the difference. The man sneered. I work hard for my ticket. Why should I be inconvenienced because she wants to play the victim card Amara inhaled, steadying herself, fighting the surge of anger that pulsed in her chest? Her instincts told her to stay quiet, to let the recording speak louder than her voice. But silence, she reminded herself, was the currency of oppression. She stood slowly, her presence commanding without effort. The murmurs fell back into quiet. I didn't want this flight suspended, she said evenly. I wanted to fly, like everyone else. I paid for my seat, like everyone else. But when someone tells you to move where you belong, you realize you're not just fighting for comfort. You're fighting for dignity. And if that costs time, then yes, it costs time. But dignity is never free. Her words landed heavily. Some passengers shifted uneasily, others nodded, and a few clapped softly. Seraphine Clade reemerged from the galley, her face pale but her voice sharp with bitterness. You're manipulating the situation, turning passengers against each other. This isn't about dignity, it's about control. Ezra barked a laugh that startled even himself. Control. That's rich. You're the one who tried to strip her of hers. The argument might have spiraled into chaos if not for the sudden vibration of dozens of phones buzzing at once. News alerts flashed across screens. Headlines, stark passenger streams alleged discrimination on Flight 372 airline grounds plane. The story had already breached the walls of the cabin, escaping into the bloodstream of public attention. Luciana's eyes widened at her phone. We're trending. Tens of thousands are watching. This isn't just a flight anymore, it's a stage. Amara's stomach tightened. A stage. That was the truth of it. Every gesture, every word, magnified beyond the fuselage, beamed into living rooms and timelines. The battle was no longer confined to 30 rows of seats. It was now a matter for the world. She sat again, her pulse steady but her mind racing. Did she reveal who she was now? Did she use her authority as COO of Skycrest Airlines to end the charade? Or would that taint the moment, turning it into a spectacle of corporate muscle rather than a raw confrontation of truth? She closed her eyes briefly, hearing her father's voice echo in memory. Never rush to show your power. First, show your humanity. When she opened her eyes, she stayed silent. For now, her truth would remain veiled. Passengers began debating openly, voices clashing like steel. Some sided with Seraphine, arguing about procedure and order. Others sided with Amara, invoking fairness and justice. The cabin became less an airplane and more a courtroom, its narrow aisle transformed into the line between accusation and defense. Captain Idris Kyle returned once more, his face grim. Ladies and gentlemen, I must inform you that corporate leadership has been alerted. A decision will be communicated shortly. Until then, I ask for patience. The businessman in the navy suit groaned again. Patience. We'll be here all night. Luciana whispered into her stream. Corporate is involved. That means this isn't going away quietly. Ezra leaned toward Amara. You know what this means, don't you? They'll come for you, to silence you or to use you. Either way, you'd better be ready. She nodded slowly. I've been ready my whole life. I just didn't know the test would come at 30,000 feet. Her words were meant only for him. But Luciana's camera caught them, the audio crisp and clear. Within moments, commenters online repeated them, the phrase beginning to crystallize into a rallying cry, ready my whole life. Seraphine, watching from the galley, heard it too. Her expression twisted, not just with anger but with something deeper fear. Fear that her authority, once unchallenged, was unraveling in real time. Amara glanced at Gareth, who studied her with quiet intensity. You're not just fighting for your seat anymore, he said softly. You're fighting for the story they'll tell about this airline tomorrow. Maybe even the whole industry. Amara looked toward the small oval window, the darkening tarmac beyond, lights flickering across the runway like impatient stars. The plane remained grounded, caught between departure and reckoning. She whispered to herself, words only she could hear. If the world is watching, then let them see the truth, all of it, and for the first time that day, she felt not just the burden of the moment, but its possibility. The cabin had taken on a strange stillness, the kind of silence that hums with tension rather than peace. Every conversation now felt like an echo in a chamber that was too small for so much conflict. People leaned in their seats, whispering fiercely, their eyes darting toward Amara as if she held both the cause and the cure for their delay. Luciana Marquise's phone was still live, the little red dot glowing in the corner. Her viewership had climbed past 50,000. Every word spoken in the cabin was not just heard but transmitted, dissected, amplified by strangers across the world. Amara felt the heat of their stares on her skin, but she sat composed, her spine straight, her hands folded loosely on her lap. Inside, though, her thoughts churned. She had waited. She had allowed the truth to unfold on its own, allowed the scanner and the passengers' testimonies to reveal what had happened. But waiting had reached its limit. The airline's corporate leadership was already aware. Cameras outside this plane would soon flood the story with speculation. If she didn't claim her truth now, others would do it for her, twisting it to fit their own agendas. Ezra Thorne leaned toward her, his weathered eyes sharp. "The time's come. Don't let them write your story for you." She nodded slowly. She thought of her father's words, etched into her memory. "Speak so even the walls remember." Amara rose from her seat. The cabin hushed immediately. The ripple of movement was captured by dozens of phones, their lenses waiting, hungry. She stepped into the narrow aisle, her gaze steady, her tone measured. "Most of you know me only as another passenger, someone who bought a ticket, boarded, and asked to sit where she belonged. That should have been enough." Her voice grew stronger, the stillness amplifying her words. "But for some here, it wasn't. For some, my presence in this seat required explanation, suspicion, proof." A murmur stirred, some passengers shifting guiltily in their seats. Seraphine Clade stood frozen near the galley, her face a mask of disbelief. Amara continued, "What you don't know, what hasn't been said, is who I am outside this cabin. My name is Amara Valon. I am the Chief Operating Officer of Skycrest Airlines." The reaction was instant. Gasps, sharp intakes of breath, a flurry of voices rising like a wave. Phones trembled as passengers tried to capture the moment. Gareth Sloane's mouth parted in awe, while Luciana's hand shook as she whispered into her phone. "You heard it here. She's the COO. The airline's own executive is being targeted on her own plane." Seraphine's face went pale, then red, her composure splintering. That's impossible," she stammered. "Why wouldn't you say so from the beginning?" Amara's gaze locked on her. "Because my title shouldn't determine how I am treated. Respect should not depend on power. If I were any other passenger, I should still have been offered dignity." Her words landed like blows. Ezra tapped his cane lightly against the floor, his voice carrying with pride. "Say it louder. Child. Let them hear it in the boardrooms." The ground supervisor in the aisle shifted uneasily, his voice thin. "Ms. Valon, perhaps we should de-escalate privately." But Amara cut him off with quiet authority. "There is nothing private about this anymore. The whole world is watching because this has never been private. It has been endured silently by countless passengers who never had the platform to speak. Today, they will not be silent through me." The cabin erupted into noise cheers from some, groans from others, and above it all the constant hum of live stream comments exploding online. The story had moved beyond Flight 372. It was now a mirror held up to every airline, every gate, every passenger who had ever been told they did not belong. Seraphine's lips trembled, her voice breaking. You set me up. You tricked me." Amara's expression remained calm, but her tone was sharp. "No, I gave you the same opportunity you had with every other passenger to treat me with fairness. You chose suspicion instead. That was not my trick. That was your truth." The words silenced Seraphine completely. Her shoulders sagged, clipboard slipping from her grasp, clattering against the galley floor. Captain Idris Kale stepped into the aisle, his face grim but his tone respectful. "Ms. Valon, as captain of this flight, I acknowledge your authority as an executive of this airline. How would you like us to proceed?" The passengers stared, stunned that the question had shifted from the captain's authority to hers. Amara inhaled slowly, feeling the enormity of the moment pressing against her ribs. She spoke with calm clarity. "This flight will not depart until a full investigation is launched into the actions of this crew. Every passenger here will be compensated for the delay, and every second of this recording will be reviewed by corporate leadership. Accountability is not negotiable." Her words were final, unyielding. Some passengers clapped loudly now, others cursed under their breath, but none could deny the authority in her stance. Luciana whispered into her phone, "This is history. She's not just grounding a flight. She's grounding the old way of doing things." Ezra smiled faintly, pride glimmering in his eyes. "She's carving a crack in the wall." Amara sat again, her body calm though her mind pulsed with adrenaline. She had crossed the threshold. The reveal had changed everything. No longer undercover, no longer anonymous, she was now a symbol, and symbols could not be put back into shadows. She stared out the window, the tarmac lights flickering like distant stars. In the reflection of the glass, she saw her own face not just weary from the day, but resolute, etched with the knowledge that from this moment forward, nothing about her role, her life, or her airline would ever be the same. And still, she felt no regret, because silence would never have told this story. For a long second after Amara's announcement, the cabin was suspended in silence. A silence not of peace but of stunned realization. Her words hung in the recycled air, heavy and undeniable. Then the silence cracked, releasing a torrent of sound gasps, cheers, groans, and the rustle of dozens of passengers scrambling to capture every angle of her face on their phones. Luciana Marquez nearly dropped hers in the excitement, whispering breathlessly into the mic. "You heard it. The COO of Skycrest Airlines is sitting right here, in seat 2A, calling out her own crew for discrimination. This is beyond viral. This is history in motion." The live stream comments scrolled faster than she could read. Messages of solidarity, of outrage, of disbelief flooded the feed. Reporters were already reaching out in the chat, dropping their handles, promising exposure. The number in the corner jumped past 100,000. Amara sat back in her seat, calm on the surface though her pulse thundered. She had stepped through the door she could never close. The weight of her title pressed harder now. Every word she spoke would carry not only for herself, but for the airline, for the industry, for the countless passengers who would see themselves reflected in this moment. Ezra Thorne leaned toward her, his voice warm and steady. "You just lit a fire that won't burn out. Don't let anyone tell you to smother it. Across the aisle, Gareth Sloane rubbed his temples, then chuckled softly. Well, Amara, you've made it impossible for me to ever complain about a delayed flight again. He looked at her with quiet respect. You've got more courage than most boardrooms put together. But not every passenger shared that admiration. The man in the navy suit, his face red with irritation, stood again. So what now? We sit here for hours while you turn this into your personal crusade. Some of us have lives to live, jobs to keep. Not everything is about making a statement. Luciana swung her phone toward him. If it wasn't a statement, would you still be shouting? Would you still be angry if it had happened to you? Or would you want someone to stand up for you too? The man scowled but said nothing. His cheeks flushed deeper. Seraphine Clade, still by the galley, trembled visibly, though her pride refused to collapse. Her voice cracked as she spoke, addressing the passengers rather than Amara. She tricked me. She hid who she was, waiting to embarrass me. That's manipulation, not injustice. Amara turned her head, her eyes steady, her voice calm but sharp enough to slice. Seraphine, my name should not have mattered. My humanity should have been enough. The words hit harder than any raised voice. Seraphine recoiled slightly, her clipboard forgotten on the floor, her authority in shreds. The ground supervisor cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. Ms. Veylan, corporate leadership has been notified. They are requesting to speak with you directly before further decisions are made. A ripple of murmurs spread across the cabin. The idea that leadership, her peers, her colleagues were already scrambling behind closed doors made the moment feel even more surreal. Amara nodded calmly, patched them through. A portable phone was handed over, the line connecting to the airline's crisis response team. The passengers watched with open curiosity, straining to hear her side of the conversation. "Amara," came the clipped voice of a senior executive, one she recognized instantly, Thomas Edris, the airline's general counsel. "We need you to de-escalate this immediately. Suspend the live stream. Get the passengers calmed. We can handle the crew issue internally." Amara's lips curved faintly. De-escalate. That's what we've been doing for decades. Silencing, minimizing, pretending. And where has that gotten us to this exact moment, with the world watching? I won't bury this one. Edris's voice hardened. "Amara, you're putting the airline at enormous risk," she replied evenly. "No, the airline put itself at risk when it allowed discrimination to fester unchecked. I'm protecting it by cutting out the rot before it consumes us entirely." There was a long silence on the line, then a sigh. "Then at least consider the optics. Don't name crew members directly. Don't make it personal." Amara's gaze drifted to Seraphine, standing pale and stiff by the galley. Her jaw clenched, but her voice remained controlled. This was never personal. It's systemic. But systemic rot shows itself through individual actions, and accountability begins with those who carry them out. She ended the call, handing back the phone with calm finality. Turning to the passengers, she raised her voice just enough to carry, "As of this moment, I'm placing the lead flight attendant, Seraphine Clade, on immediate suspension pending investigation. She will be removed from this flight before it departs. No customer should fear humiliation when they take their rightful seat." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Some clapped, some muttered angrily about delays, but none could deny the force of her words. Luciana caught every second, her voice trembling with the weight of the moment. "You heard her. She just suspended her own crew member live, right here on Flight 372. Seraphine's face drained of color. Her lips parted as though to protest, but no words came. She turned to the captain, desperate, but Cale only lowered his gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the chain of command now beyond his control. Amara exhaled slowly, feeling the tremor of adrenaline in her hands. It was her first strike, deliberate and irreversible. The world would debate it endlessly. Some would call it justice, others vengeance. But in her heart, she knew it was necessary. Ezra leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with something like pride. That's how you change the story, one truth at a time. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted again, the energy thick with a mix of outrage and awe. Some passengers whispered furiously about rebooking. Others applauded louder now, emboldened by her firmness. The plane was no longer just grounded, it had become a tribunal, a stage, a battlefield. Amara sat again, her face calm but her mind racing. She knew this was only the beginning. Suspending Seraphine was a statement, but the real battle would come later in the boardrooms, in the headlines, in the homes of every traveler deciding whether to trust Skycrest Airlines again. But for now, she allowed herself one deep breath, one moment of stillness before the storm returned, because storms always returned. The decision had been spoken aloud, and there was no taking it back. Seraphine Clade stood frozen by the galley, the color draining from her face as if the air itself had been pulled away. The authority she once wielded had evaporated, stripped not by anger or shouting, but by the calm clarity of Amara Velon's words. The ground supervisor gave a subtle nod to the two security officers still present in the cabin. With professional detachment, they stepped toward Seraphine. "Ma'am," one of them said evenly, "you've been relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. Please gather your belongings." Gasps rippled through the rows. Passengers craned their necks, phones lifted high, capturing the scene from every angle. The live-stream chat scrolled in a blur, disbelief and vindication colliding in real time. Seraphine shook her head, her voice breaking. "This is wrong. I've served this airline for 15 years. I followed procedure." Her words faltered as she caught sight of the cameras, the dozens of eyes on her, the silent captain who refused to intervene. Her pride fought desperately against the humiliation pressing down on her. "You chose suspicion over service," Amara said quietly, but loud enough for the cabin to hear. "Procedure doesn't protect prejudice." The words silenced Seraphine completely. Her hands trembled as she retrieved her bag from the galley. With every step toward the cabin door, the distance between her past authority and her present disgrace grew wider. Some passengers clapped softly, others averted their eyes, discomfort etched across their faces. A few muttered that the punishment was too harsh, that humiliation shouldn't be entertainment. But the cameras didn't look away. They captured every moment as Seraphine disappeared through the cabin door, escorted down the jet bridge and into uncertainty. The door closed, leaving behind an almost tangible shift in the air. Authority had been upended. The rules of the cabin had been rewritten. Amara remained seated, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. But inside, her heart pounded with a mix of relief and unease. The act had been necessary. She believed that fully but necessary acts carried consequences, and consequences had a way of multiplying. Ezra Thorne tapped his cane against the floor softly, breaking the silence. That's one brick pulled from the wall, but the wall's still standing. Don't let them make you think one brick is enough. Amara nodded slightly, appreciating the weight of his words. Luciana Marquez adjusted her phone, speaking directly into the camera. You just witnessed it live. A senior flight attendant removed from duty after the COO of Skycrest Airlines exposed discriminatory treatment. This isn't just a story about one seat on one flight. This is about an industry that has to answer for how it treats people, who it chooses to believe, and who it chooses to doubt. The viewership count on her screen skyrocketed past 500,000. The chat erupted with calls for boycotts, praise for Amara's composure, and heated debates that mirrored the arguments inside the plane itself. A man in the back of first class stood abruptly, his voice sharp. So, we're all just supposed to sit here while this circus drags on? People are losing money, missing weddings, missing connections because one executive decided to turn this into her personal crusade. His words drew nods from a few grumbles of agreement, but before Amara could respond, Gareth Sloan rose from his seat. His voice was calm, firm, carrying the authority of someone used to boardrooms. No, she turned it into accountability. If you think your inconvenience outweighs someone else's dignity, then maybe you should ask yourself what kind of world you're in a hurry to get back to. The cabin buzzed with tension, voices rising again. Some applauded Gareth's defense. Others cursed under their breath. The division wasn't clean, it cut across age, race, class, even political leanings. The airplane had become a microcosm of a society split between those who wanted peace at any cost and those who demanded justice. No matter the disruption, Amara let the noise swell, then lifted her voice, steady and deliberate. Enough. The words sliced through the clamor, pulling heads toward her once again. Her gaze swept the rows, her eyes calm but unyielding. This is no longer about me. It is about a system that has excused bias as procedure, that is hidden behind schedules and policies while passengers were made to feel lesser. Today, it stops. Not just here, but everywhere this airline flies. The cabin stilled. Even those who disagreed fell quiet, sensing the gravity of her tone. She continued, "Every passenger here will be compensated for their delay. Every recording will be reviewed. Every complaint that has ever been dismissed will be reopened. And every crew member in this airline will undergo renewed training, not the kind that checks boxes, but the kind that changes behavior. That is my promise, not as your fellow passenger, but as the Chief Operating Officer of Skycrest Airlines." The declaration hung in the air, undeniable and absolute. Ezra's lips curved into a faint smile. Now you've turned a moment into a movement. The ground supervisor shifted nervously, pulling out a tablet as if confirming her words against corporate orders. His expression betrayed the truth she wasn't bluffing. Luciana's voice trembled with awe. She just promised systemic reform live. To 500,000 people and counting. Gareth sank back into his seat, his expression a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "Amara, you realize you just committed the airline to millions in costs, right?" Amara looked at him calmly, and millions more in credibility gained. Customers will forgive delays. They won't forgive dignity stolen. The man in the back scoffed, muttering about theatrics, but even his voice carried less force now, drowned beneath the tide of something larger. Captain Idris Kale stepped forward once again, his voice steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are awaiting final instructions from corporate headquarters. For now, Please remain seated. We will inform you the moment we have clarity." But clarity had already arrived. The plane was no longer a vessel for travel. It was a stage for reckoning, and Amara Valon had seized it fully. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a brief moment. Behind her calm expression, memories rose of her father marching for voting rights, of her mother teaching her to hold her head high when others tried to bow it. Their voices mingled in her mind, reminding her that every act of resistance carried both cost and legacy. When she opened her eyes, she looked around the cabin not just at the Allies, not just at the critics, but at everyone. She wanted them all to remember this flight not as a disruption, but as a turning point. Because turning points, she knew, only revealed themselves in hindsight. But this one, she could feel in her bones. It was history in the making. By the time Seraphine was escorted off and the cabin settled into uneasy silence, the story had already outgrown the plane. News alerts buzzed through passengers' phones. Headlines flashing airline COO grounds, flight after discrimination allegation. Some phones played live clips of Amara herself, her calm face already circulating across networks. Luciana Marquez stared at her screen, her hand trembling. "It's everywhere," she whispered. CNN, BBC, even local stations back home. They're running the feed. The live stream's viewership counter crossed 1 million. The chat scrolled so fast it blurred into a stream of color voices from around the world demanding justice, recounting their own experiences, praising Amara, mocking the airline, or raging at the disruption. Ezra Thorne sat back, his cane resting against his leg. His eyes closed briefly as though savoring the vindication he thought he'd never see. "It took the world this long to listen," he murmured. "But finally, they hear us." The man in the Navy suit muttered again, but even his protests were quieter now, drowned beneath the thunder outside the fuselage. Captain Idris Kale returned, his shoulders squared, his jaw set. He leaned toward Amara, his voice pitched low but urgent. "Corporate leadership is demanding immediate clarity. They want a resolution, not another promise. They're scared." Amara studied him for a moment, then spoke with calm precision. "Then give me the line." The ground supervisor hesitated but handed her the phone again. Within seconds, she was connected. This time not to a lawyer but to William Herrick, the airline's CEO. His voice was taut, controlled, carrying the strain of a man already aware the company's reputation was spiraling in real time. "Amara," he said, "what are you doing? You've turned a personnel issue into a global scandal. Pull this back before it destroys us." Amara's voice was steady. "It's not a personnel issue, William. It's a systemic issue. And it was always going to destroy us, just more quietly. Passenger by passenger. Humiliation by humiliation. This time, the silence broke, and we're better for it. You're making commitments we can't afford." Herrick snapped. "Compensation for passengers, reopening complaints, overhauling training, it's reckless." Amara closed her eyes briefly, then opened them, her voice clear. "Reckless is thinking we can survive without trust. Reckless is betting passengers will keep paying for service that disrespects them. The cost of reform is high, but the cost of losing our humanity is higher." There was a long silence on the line. When Herrick spoke again, his voice had softened. "And if I refuse to endorse your promises," Amara looked toward Luciana's phone, still streaming, still carrying every moment to the world outside. Her answer was simple. Then the passengers and the millions already watching will know where the rot begins. Herrick inhaled sharply, then exhaled in defeat. Fine, do it your way. But God help us if this backfires. It won't, Amara said, unless we fail to follow through. She ended the call and returned the phone. The cabin buzzed with murmurs. Passengers weren't just watching anymore, they were participating in something larger than their flight. Luciana raised her phone higher, her voice trembling with awe. You just heard it, live. The CEO himself folded. Skycrest Airlines is committing to systemic reform because one passenger refused to move. Amara rose once more, her calm voice carrying through the cabin. This delay has cost you hours, but it has gained you something greater, the assurance that your dignity is not negotiable. Skycrest Airlines will overhaul its training, reopen every ignored complaint, and compensate every passenger on this flight. That is my promise, and now it is the company's. A ripple of applause began, hesitant at first, then louder, swelling until it filled the cabin. Ezra tapped his cane against the floor like a drumbeat, his eyes glistening. Gareth Sloane clapped slowly, then firmly, his expression one of profound respect. Even some who had grumbled before now joined, their frustration softened by the clarity of her conviction. But not everyone applauded. A woman in the third row stood, her face twisted with irritation. You can't fix the world with one speech. You just ruined my trip, cost me a contract, and made yourself a hero at the expense of the rest of us. Amara turned toward her, her gaze steady. If one delay can undo your contract, then maybe it was never built to last. But the dignity of people, of customers, of human beings that is built to last if we protect it. That's what today is about. The woman faltered, her anger still burning, but her argument collapsing under the weight of Amara's words. She sat down, muttering under her breath, but the applause didn't stop. Luciana lowered her phone for a moment, her eyes glistening. Do you realize what you've just done? You didn't just ground a flight, you grounded an era. The old way of doing things, of pretending these moments didn't matter. It's over now. Amara exhaled slowly, her body steady though her spirit trembled with the enormity of it all. She had not planned to become a symbol today. She had planned only to travel, to observe quietly. But fate had its own script, and she had chosen to speak rather than whisper. Captain Kyle nodded to her, his respect clear. We'll wait for corporate's final instructions before departure. But make no mistake, this flight will never be remembered for where it was headed, only for what happened inside. Ezra smiled faintly, his voice carrying the weight of history. And that's how change begins. Not with comfort, but with courage. The cabin settled into a fragile calm. Some passengers leaned back, resigned to the delay. Others whispered excitedly, crafting the stories they would tell when they landed. But all of them knew they had witnessed something they would never forget. Amara returned to her seat, gazing out the window at the runway lights stretching into the distance. Her reflection stared back calm, resolute, unshaken. She whispered to herself, a vow she meant for no one but her own soul. This won't end here. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. This is just the beginning. And deep down, she knew the firestorm outside was only just starting. The jet bridge was alive with flashing lights and raised voices. Passengers filed out, some shielding their faces from cameras, others leaning into them, eager to tell their story. Microphones jutted forward like spears, reporters calling questions above the din. It was as though the quiet conflict inside the fuselage had burst into the open air, expanding until it consumed the terminal itself. Amara Velan walked at the center of it, her back straight, her gaze calm. Beside her, Ezra Thorne gripped his cane tightly but kept pace, his weathered features illuminated by the strobe and glare camera flashes. Luciana Marquez still held her phone aloft, live streaming every second. Gareth Sloan stayed close, protective in his silence. Captain Idris Kyle, though clearly exhausted, maintained his dignity, his pilot's uniform lending weight to every step. "Ms. Velan, do you regret canceling the flight?" shouted one reporter. "Amara." "Were you making a political statement?" asked another. "Isn't this just corporate theater someone jeered from the back?" Amara didn't respond immediately. She paused at the edge of the crowd, then turned, her voice clear enough to cut through the chaos. "This isn't theater. This is reality. And reality hurts. But if we don't face it, if we don't fix it, it will keep hurting passengers like Mr. Thorne, like myself, like countless others who have been treated as if they don't belong. That ends today." The terminal erupted again, questions cascading over each other. She moved forward, refusing to be swept into sound bites. Every word had to matter. Inside a secured conference room moments later, the noise of the terminal muffled. She finally exhaled. Malcolm, her executive assistant, was already there, laptop open, flanked by a team from legal and public relations. Their faces bore the fatigue of a long day, but also a wary admiration. "You've gone viral in 37 countries," Malcolm reported. "The clip of you revealing your COO badge has over 20 million views. The hashtags are everywhere. Equal skies." She canceled the flight. Dignity first. Valerie Chen from PR frowned. "But there's backlash too. Some passengers are furious. Headlines about disruption, economic losses, shareholder anxiety. The conservative networks are painting you as reckless." Amara lowered herself into a chair, her voice steady. "Reckless is ignoring the truth. Reckless is letting humiliation become routine." She glanced toward Ezra, who had accepted a seat nearby. "We've been reckless for decades, and the cost is lives diminished by discrimination. If today makes some uncomfortable, then good. Growth is never comfortable." Ezra tapped his cane against the carpet, spoken like someone who understands what this really is. It's not about a seat, it's about history. Malcolm adjusted his glasses, his tone cautious. "The board is convening in 2 hours. Herrick already spoke with you, but they want you in person. Expect hostility. Some directors are furious. Stock dipped 8% after the news hit. Then we'll show them what's worth more than stock." Amara replied softly. A silence settled over the room. She felt the fatigue pressing against her bones, but beneath it pulsed something else resolve. The fight was shifting, from cabin to conference table, but the essence remained unchanged. Dignity was not negotiable. Later that evening, the boardroom lights reflected off polished oak and glass. Men and women in suits leaned forward, tension radiating across the table. William Herrick sat at the head, his jaw tight. "Amara," he began, his tone measured, "you've ignited a global firestorm. Some say you've saved the airline's soul. Others say you've doomed it. We need clarity. What exactly do you intend?" Amara stood. Her voice carried the weight of the cabin, The murmurs of passengers, the tired gratitude in Ezra's eyes, the unflinching solidarity in Luciana's. "What I intend," she said, "is to dismantle the invisible scaffolding that has held prejudice in place on every flight we operate. We will audit our complaints, retrain every employee, install accountability measures, and publish our progress transparently. Not a press release, not a one-time donation. Transformation." Howard Blackwell, one of the longest-serving directors, slammed a palm on the table. Transformation. You grounded 300 people today. You jeopardized millions in revenue. Do you know what regulators will demand now? Do you know the chaos you've unleashed? Amara's gaze never wavered. Chaos was already here. I simply refuse to hide it. If we act now, if we choose dignity over denial, we can lead this industry instead of becoming its cautionary tale. The room bristled with whispers. Herrick studied her carefully, weighing risk against inevitability. He finally sighed. "You're asking for enormous latitude. If this fails, it's not just your career, it's all of ours. Then let's not fail." Amara answered simply. Ezra's words echoed in her mind later that night as she returned to her apartment, the skyline glittering beyond the window. She sat on her sofa, shoes kicked aside, exhaustion finally breaking through her composure. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, messages of support, vitriol, media requests, threats, gratitude. She silenced it, needing a moment of stillness. The reflection in the glass showed not just her own face, but generations standing behind her. Her parents, who had marched in their own youth. Her colleagues who had been silenced. The countless passengers who had swallowed indignities to reach their destinations. She whispered into the quiet. Today was a spark. Tomorrow must be the fire, weeks later, in a training facility outside the city. She stood before rows of flight attendants, pilots, ground crew. Behind her, the screen displayed the new initiative Equal Horizons, building dignity into every flight. Her voice was calm, but every syllable carried the force of conviction. This is not punishment. This is not blame. This is opportunity. To become better. To become fairer. To ensure that no passenger wonders if they belong when they've paid the same as anyone else. We will not just fly. We will fly with dignity. Some faces glowed with hope. Others were guarded, skeptical. That was fine. Change never arrived to unanimous applause. But Amara knew the work had begun, and once begun, it could not be undone. Months later, she boarded another flight to San Francisco. The greeting was warm, consistent, professional exactly as it should be. She sat in her seat, gazing around the cabin, noting the absence of tension where once it had been thick. Ezra's words returned. "It's not about a seat, it's about history." She smiled faintly, closing her eyes as the engines roared to life. History was still being written, but for once, it was being written in the skies by those who refused to stay silent. And this time, the world was watching, and so, a flight that never left the ground managed to soar far higher than anyone expected. What began with a quiet attempt to displace one passenger became a storm that exposed the cracks in an entire system. Amara Valon did more than defend her seat. She defended the principle that every traveler deserves dignity, no matter who they are or where they sit. The fallout was loud. Careers ended. Policies shifted. The airline faced its reckoning. Yet, beyond the corporate headlines, the true weight of this story rests in the silence it shattered. No longer could passengers who had swallowed indignities believe they were alone. No longer could an industry claim ignorance when bias was live-streamed to the world. But with every act of courage comes a reminder the work is not finished. The skies may feel fairer today, but fairness is fragile. It must be guarded, nurtured, insisted upon every flight, every passenger, every crew. As you reflect on this story, carry with you both the ache of injustice and the beauty of accountability. Let it remind you that small acts of dignity can spark change far beyond their moment. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Together, we'll keep these conversations alive and ensure the skies and the world become a place where everyone belongs.